Ping 1, Ping 2, Ping 3, 4, 5, Ping 6, 7, the 7th arc.
Hello, I'm Sergio Cavaiuolo, an engineer from Adelaide in South Australia. I was absolutely bemused by the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. The mystery was pretty much my spare time hobby over the last 4 years. I looked at a lot of different aspects relating to the mystery, publications, the official reports, and to me there is actually some real logical and technical reasons and clues that you can put together that actually tell us where MH370 ended up and where it didn't end up. You see, there really is only one place on the planet that the aircraft could actually be, and that's in the Maldives. Why? Put simply, because there were actually real people, witnesses, that actually saw the plane airborne over there towards the end of its flight. But before you can appreciate that, it's important to understand why the plane is not actually in the southern Indian Ocean. It never went there. So you see, on paper, we understood MH370 had gone to the southern Indian Ocean or was somewhere along the 7th arc. So we focused the search in that region. However, physically, MH370 was actually never on any of these rings. It was actually somewhere else. The true aircraft location rings, when you analyse the raw satellite data from first principles, are not here. They're actually here.
Ping 1, Ping 2, Ping 3, 4, 5, Ping 6, 7, the 7th arc, the 7th arc, the 7th arc.
This is where the Inmarsat 7th arc is actually located. It is not where we understood it to be along the southern Indian Ocean.
Now, contrary to the official conclusion, the location of the rings don't go towards the southern Indian Ocean. If you look at the sequence of the rings, this tells us a wealth of information about what was going on with MH370 on that morning. This says that humans were still flying the plane, and look, most likely the pilots were still trying to find a place to land this plane. I believe the pilots were actually trying to save the plane. I certainly don't believe in any of the hijacking, rogue pilot, suicide mission theories that are bantering around with MH370.
The most logical reason is that they were heading for an emergency airport. There are several theories about what caused flight MH370 to suddenly turn back over the Gulf of Thailand. Here I take a look at one of the theories.
So one of the things that might have caused MH370 to suddenly turn back over the Gulf of Thailand is some sort of external engine fire.
The conclusion from my investigations is that the pilots of MH370 are stuck with a plane they can fly, but they can't land it. They can't land it on solid ground.
They kept the aircraft airborne for the maximum possible time, as long as they could, because it was probably the safest place to be. Because the one thing they knew is they could still fly this plane. They weren't falling out of the sky. What they didn't know, the problem was going to be trying to land it. So I think they couldn't land it on solid ground, otherwise it would have been down. They knew they only had one shot at putting this plane on the ground. And I think they were desperately looking for some remote location and uninhabited by population with shallow water to attempt an emergency landing with a crippled aircraft. Some people call it a ditching, and I think they were looking at islands.
But you can start to understand this once you have the aircraft location rings, the Inmarsat ping rings, correctly projected. You see, you have to have the aircraft location rings correctly projected onto the Earth, and then you can start to understand what was going on with MH370 on the morning it vanished, and you can actually solve the mystery. You can see that the aircraft took a west-east-west, like a skewed zigzag path across the Indian Ocean.
The eyewitness sighting is probably the most important piece of the puzzle, where you actually had real people that saw this aircraft. They described it perfectly, flying in their skies. So obviously if it's there, it can't be in the southern Indian Ocean, and there's obviously a problem with the way the analysis was done, or the Inmarsat data back in 2014. Hold that thought. So make no mistake, the aircraft that was in the Maldives on the morning of 8th of March 2014 was Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. It's corroborated by the raw satellite data if you analyse it from first principles methods.
You see, from the air, the reef flat of an atoll,
it looks like a pad where you can try and land an aircraft on, and without causing any injury to anyone on the ground if you find a clear spot.
From a pilot's perspective, there's essentially a makeshift runway here to attempt a landing. You've got some shallow water, you've got some hard rock underneath, so it was probably the
only thing
the MH370 pilots had by way of a landing strip under the circumstances. Now, I've been to the region, and I can tell you there is absolutely nothing around for kilometres, but the problem is, on the atoll, it's like landing on the top of an underwater volcano, and there's absolutely no way of knowing exactly how the aircraft is going to stop. So here's my scenario. The pilots came in to land along the atoll, and they're coming in to land on the atoll, flaps down, flaperon down, and they come in and they touch down in the water. You remember the trailing edge of the flaperon and the Tanzanian flap is all scraped away. Well, to me, you would get that as a result of landing on the hard coral reef surface of the Maldives atoll as the plane landed and scraped after sinking from the water. At the moment, there are still disconnects in the mystery. What I've put together is a presentation to share some of the results of my work in the hope that it may help find the missing wreckage and the 239 loved ones still missing. I encourage you to take your time, watch my video, and by the time you get to the end of it, you'll understand two really important things about the mystery of MH370. And that is, number one, why the aircraft never actually went to the southern Indian Ocean. And number two, the location of where best to search for the missing wreckage of the plane. The other part of this presentation is for me to show you, take a closer look at this submerged aircraft object that I found back in 2015 and helping you understand why I'm convinced it's an aerial image of the missing wreckage of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. It makes sense in terms of its location is in proximity to the Maldives eyewitness sightings, and now what I'll show you in this presentation also is that it's corroborated by the raw Inmarsat satellite data. You see, it has all the makings of being the missing wreckage, and it corroborates with a lot of the other key pieces of the mystery, which I also talk about in this presentation.
No, my dear friends, the vanishing of Flight 370 was a tragedy, a desperate and heroic race against time, trying to save 239 who on that day were united as one.
So where is Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370? Why is this such an unprecedented mystery? A most bizarre mystery. 239 people and a state-of-the-art Boeing 777-200ER still missing. Why is it still unsolved? Why can't we find it? Well, we have the official conclusion that says Flight MH370 ended up in the southern Indian Ocean. Just quickly to recap, the aircraft took off over the Malaysian peninsula heading towards Beijing from Kuala Lumpur, did a sudden turn back over the Gulf of Thailand, and then was tracked by radar heading northwest towards the Andaman Sea. Now we know the aircraft kept flying for some 7+ hours because it was tracked by an Inmarsat satellite network which was exchanging messages with the satellite terminal on board the aircraft and the Perth ground station. Now the analysis of the raw Inmarsat satellite data used timing information out of the raw data logs and calculated the range of the aircraft from the satellite and projected a set of what they call location rings or handshake rings or ping rings over the course of the flight, where the location of the aircraft was unknown and the path of the location rings showed that MH370 tracked to the southern Indian Ocean. And so over a 2-year search was focused there along what was called the 7th arc, which is basically the 7th handshake or 7th ping that was exchanged over the Inmarsat network. So yet, despite a 2-year underwater search of this 120,000 kilometre search area, no trace of the plane nor any debris from it was ever found there.
So the question is, why?
The problem is that there are still disconnects in the mystery of Flight MH370. There are pieces of the puzzle that should fit together, corroborate, but they don't.
So when you look at all the pieces of the MH370 puzzle, so I think there's 6 really important pieces that actually tell us where MH370 ended up. I've drawn them in here on a Venn diagram. It's a good tool. It lets you group related pieces of information or related objects together. So what I've done here is I've put all the pieces together that suggest MH370 actually did end up in the Maldives, and I've put the other circle here which represents the data, information, analysis that says MH370 ended up in the southern Indian Ocean.
So what we have is the Maldives eyewitness sightings. We have a number of people, 25 individuals who are adamant that the aircraft flew over the Maldive Islands. We have a submerged aircraft object that I've been investigating that's in Maldivian waters, and it has all the makings of being the wreckage of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. We have the acoustic event that shows a close correlation to the Maldives location, in which an underwater sound wave was effectively captured around about the time MH370 disappeared, and its characteristics were consistent with a large aircraft impacting the ocean. We also have a number of pieces of suspected aircraft debris that washed up on some Maldives islands. What I've shown in the centre here is the West Indian Ocean debris. That quite a lot of debris has been turning up along the Western Indian Ocean, along the east coast of Africa, the Mozambique Channel, Reunion Island. Now I've shown that in the centre of the Venn diagram because it's actually common to both the Southern Indian Ocean and the Maldives, because if you have a look at the ocean currents, all the debris that has been turning up in the Western Indian Ocean could have actually originated from the Maldives and got there from a crash site in the Maldives. But it also obviously supports the current official conclusion that it could have come from the Southern Indian Ocean.
The eyewitness sighting is probably the most important piece of the puzzle, where you actually had real people that saw this aircraft. They described it perfectly, flying in their skies. So obviously if it's there, it can't be in the Southern Indian Ocean, and there's obviously a problem with the way the analysis was done, or the Inmarsat data back in 2014. Hold that thought, we'll get back to that shortly. So if MH370 had actually gone to the Southern Indian Ocean, here's the dilemma: you wouldn't have any of this. This wouldn't exist. You wouldn't have any witnesses that claim they saw this plane. In fact, they described it to a T. If you listen to their testimonies, the plane was in their skies. You wouldn't have an acoustic event. You wouldn't have suspected aircraft debris, but it's there. So what this picture says is that we actually don't have the right answer as to where MH370 ended up.
What it really says is that MH370 never went to the Southern Indian Ocean.
The SIO conclusion is the odd one out.
There's a problem with the never before used technique that projected a set of location rings to the Southern Indian Ocean.
The most important question that needed to be answered to solve the mystery of MH370 is this: why does the Inmarsat satellite data not corroborate with the Maldives eyewitness sightings?
What I've shown here is the seventh arc, the Southern Indian Ocean conclusion, which was a location that was derived by calculation of timing information back in 2014 from the raw satellite data. And over here, some 5,000 kilometres away, we have the Maldives eyewitness sightings of MH370 flying over the Maldives.
You see, if you look at the two events at a slightly broader scale, they're actually connected in time, they corroborate in time. Why do I say that? Well, because the last handshake that was recorded on the satellite log at 019 UTC was only 56 minutes earlier than the Maldives sightings of MH370 flying over the island of Kuta Huvadu. So in time, the two events corroborated. But the way the analysis of the location based on the satellite data was done, it disconnected the two by about 5,000 kilometres. So that's a problem in itself. You see, so from both perspectives, they should actually match, because the Maldivians are adamant they saw this plane, and we know that it also got tracked by the satellite data.
The plane was traveling from this direction to that direction. I was remembering the colors of it. It was dark blue color and very less red color.
So many people saw that flight.
Kudohuduge gaganaka ekavis mihika flight fenunu kama bune eki mihunna boat fenuniru horewun tanuge gotun boat fenifawani ekiwa. Kudohudu matin boat fenunu mihun tagwe terega boat emme reach fenunu ekeki ade abdaruhama. Malaysia Airlines ke flight ke photo dekkumun Abdurshid buni hama yaginomes ei.
Now let's
take a look at what I call Independent Evidence 1, IE1, and that is an aerial image of what I believe is the missing wreckage of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 resting in waters of the Maldives after an attempted emergency landing or ditching in this remotely isolated and uninhabited location. See, it has all the makings of being the missing plane.
Here's a zoomed in picture of the submerged plane, and I've highlighted the features just to reiterate that it's an aircraft, it's a plane, and it's the size of a Boeing 777. So here's the two wings. Let me draw that for you. Here's one wing here, looks fairly well intact, and here's the other wing on the opposite side that actually looks a bit twisted. Up the top we have what resembles a tail assembly, and here is the central fuselage. Notice here it actually looks like it has the bulge that's typical of the underside of a Boeing 777. So when I looked at this for a while, at one point I thought it's possible that I'm looking at an inverted plane, that it's upside down. It might have flipped as it was sinking, so we're looking at the bottom side. That's just an observation.
So try this little exercise. If you take a screenshot of this image on your mobile phone, zoom into the right wing here and take a really close look at it, you can actually see a chunk missing where the right flap is missing. Have a look.
It looks like a plane. The shape of this object resembles that of a plane. Look at the image here. It measures 60 meters approximately by 60 meters. You compare that to the wingspan and length of a Boeing 777-200ER, it's very close. This is about 61 by 64, so they're on par. It has all the features of an aircraft: two wings, a tail, and a central fuselage. Here's another view of the same object from a different orientation. So I've labelled what looks like the tail, two wings. At the front end here we have what looks like, to me, a broken nose section. It's disconnected from the rest of the submerged plane here. Now, interesting, if you remember some of the debris, there was some debris from the interior cabin, just behind the first class cabin. So this would support the fuselage having an opening where some of the internal debris can actually escape. What's also important is to recognize that it actually appears to be near fully intact. Now you would get that typically from the plane sinking as a result of an attempted emergency landing or ditching in the location.
So when I look at this submerged aircraft, and given some of the other research that I've been doing, this is my own artist's impression of what I think we will find if we search this location. So I think most of the fuselage is fairly well intact, but possibly damaged and a little bit twisted. But the nose section is broken off, as you can can see it as a piece in the image that's actually disconnected from the rest of the aircraft. This will certainly explain a lot of questions in regards to why no major pieces of debris have actually been found. Most of it's still intact and with the aircraft. It also helps explain why some internal pieces of debris have been discovered. With the nose section separated away, obviously some of the loose internal debris can actually drift away from the wreckage site. So from my research and all the corroborating independent evidence, I was so convinced that this is an image of MH370 sitting there in the water, almost near fully intact, with a bit of the nose section broken off. So in December 2015, I took a trip to this remote location in the Maldives.
Water. So here we are, touchdown. We're good. Serge checking in.
Can you believe we're in the Indian Ocean here, having a look for this object? I think it's MH370, but let's not get overexcited just yet. We're heading, as you can see, nice and casually, we're heading towards an island. We've got a coordinate, a checkpoint coordinate, where we're going to stop, make sure our fish finder's working. We know it's working, we're just going to deploy it and check the depth. There's a depth check as we head in. Now, really excited at the moment, and hopefully the weather holds up and we'll be able to have a bit of a look around. So we checkpoint, then we're going to scan, pick up the coordinates, and then with a bit of luck drop a camera and have a look. Stay tuned. You can see the blue coral reef edge in the distance there as it meets the islands. You see, with an echo sounder, something like this on the seabed will show up as big lumps or some rigid shapes. So here's a snippet of some of the 2D sonar imagery I collected whilst I was scanning over this object.
We're trawling slowly with a echo sounder, see if we can pick up an object here. My theory here is that MH370 did a controlled landing somewhere in this region.
This is an extract from a report that I've put together on this particular sonar detection. What I think I'm looking at here, if you look at this plane, is the smooth, round, a bit of section of the central fuselage. It's quite round, it's a distinctive bump or lump.
There's a bump there, look at that. To see what this is. From TR1 to NL1. TR1 to NL1. Almost very close to NL1. Now we're at NL1. This is pretty exciting stuff. We're just doing a search pattern across the object, seeing if we can detect later on, match up what we see and what we've recorded.
In this next sonar video snippet, to me it looks like I've captured the wing piece of the aircraft. You can see a distinct sort of triangular shape with quite a distinct sharp angle and straight edge. Probably the very tip of the wing is broken off, but you can see the shape as it comes away from the fuselage, and then the straight edge when it comes down. Suddenly you get a round raised bit, which is potentially the engine housing or a bit of the fuselage. Take a look. Now this next screenshot of a page out of the report shows another part of a sonar detection where it looks like to me the top of the vertical stabilizer, the tail part that meets up against the top of the fuselage.
So where is the fundamental flaw in the search for MH370? Why has the aircraft not been found in the southern Indian Ocean?
Okay, stand by 13, we're looking at it. We're looking at it.
The reason why MH370 never actually went to the southern Indian Ocean stems back to these BTO rings. Our understanding is that these are the aircraft location rings. The problem is that actually these are not the aircraft location rings. What they are is exactly what the name suggests they are. These are BTO rings, burst timing offset rings. What was actually drawn here was not the range of the aircraft from the satellite, but rather a distance that represents the BTO measure in the log file. In order to correctly project the range of the aircraft from the satellite, you actually have to use the round trip time of a message handshake, or the pings that were sent over the Inmarsat network. The method that was used to analyse the raw data and produce these rings essentially took the BTO value, the burst timing offset value, and added a BTO calibration constant to the numbers and called it the round trip time. But that's actually not correct. That's not how the physics works. What you have to use is actually the round trip time of the message handshake, and from that you take away the processing delays around the link, and what you're left with is the correct time value that you then can derive the range from and project the location of the rings. So you see, on paper we understood MH370 had gone to the southern Indian Ocean or was somewhere along the 7th arc, so we focused the search in that region. However, physically MH370 was actually never on any of these rings. It was actually somewhere else. The true aircraft location rings, when you analyse the raw satellite data from first principles, are not here. They're actually here.
Now, contrary to the official conclusion, the location of the rings don't go towards the southern Indian Ocean.
They actually transverse west-east-west across the northern or northwestern part of the Indian Ocean. Let's have a look at the time order sequence of the ping rings as it shows us where MH370 was at the time of each handshake, or ping, as the flight time progressed.
Ping 1, ping 2, ping 3, 4, 5, ping 6, 7, the 7th arc, the 7th arc, the 7th arc.
This is where the Inmarsat 7th arc is actually located. It is not where we understood it to be along the southern Indian Ocean. This is where MH370 actually was at the time of the 7th handshake, or ping 7. This is why the underwater search along the southern Indian Ocean 7th arc could not find any trace of the missing jet. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 never actually flew to the southern Indian Ocean region of the Earth.
The reason these aircraft location rings have been projected to the wrong part of the Earth stems back to the method that was used to analyse the raw satellite data. The technique that involved using the burst timing offset measure introduced a subtle error into the analysis that leads to the calculation of the range of MH370 from the satellite.
You see, by definition of the physics, you actually have to use the round trip time of a message handshake to calculate the range of MH370 from the satellite. That's because it's the round trip time that equates directly to the round trip distance from ground station to aircraft via the satellite, and therefore provides us with a mechanism of being able to calculate the range of MH370 from the I3F1 satellite.
The problem is that the equation that was derived to compute the range of the aircraft from the satellite, this distance here, is actually not a function of round trip time, it's a function of BTO. You see, they used what was called the burst timing offset measure in the log as a measure of the round trip time, but in fact it's actually not a measure of the round trip time at all. It's something quite different. Burst timing offset is a very small measure of time in the return channel message of messages coming back from the aircraft. So the problem in the 2014 equation, that it's not a function of round trip time, means the range values that were calculated for the aircraft from the satellite at each of the log-on interrogation handshakes are not the correct range values that the aircraft was from the satellite in real life. Now, because the BTO rings, the ping rings, are derived from those range calculations, what's happened is they've been projected to a location on the Earth on paper where we think the aircraft is, but it doesn't actually correspond to where the aircraft was physically in the real world. That's why we can't find the aircraft along the 7th arc. Physically, it had gone somewhere else. But if you use the correct equation, the one that is a function of round trip time, this is the equation I got when I derived the Inmarsat link problem from scratch, from first principles. What you get is an equation that correctly calculates the range of MH370 from the satellite. So when you calculate the range values at each of the log-on interrogation handshakes using the correct formula, the ping rings or the aircraft location rings project on paper to where the aircraft was physically in the real world. So they match up.
So some of you will notice that the equation that I derived looks very similar to the equation that was derived in 2014 as part of the Inmarsat analysis. They do look similar, but actually they're quite different. In this slide, we can do a quick visual comparison. So again, reflecting back, the method that was used in 2014 analysed just return channel messages that were sent from the aircraft to the Perth ground station. And the analysis produced an aircraft to satellite range equation that looks like this. In my reanalysis activity, where I used a round trip time analysis methodology, the equation I got was this. And yes, they do look very similar. However, this one that was used in 2014 is not actually a function of round trip time.
It's a function of BTO.
My equation that I derived is actually a function of the handshake round trip time.
Remember, we mentioned earlier that as per the physics, it is the round trip time that needs to be used to calculate the correct range of MH370 from the satellite.
So you can probably start to appreciate where the problem has occurred in the original analysis.
The problem was using the burst timing offset measure from the satellite log file to compute the range.
So let's compare the two equations. So this equation actually shows that MH370 tracked to the southern Indian Ocean because it produces range values that puts the rings diverging out to the southern Indian Ocean. Remember, but it hasn't used round trip time to do it.
So it hasn't actually implemented the underlying physics for solving the problem.
Whereas this equation, my first principle equation, when you plug in the log-on interrogation handshake round trip times, what you get is a very interesting picture. This shows that MH370 actually tracked to the northwest Indian Ocean, not to the southern Indian Ocean. So what we actually have in analysis, the effect of using this incorrect equation is that the MH370 location rings, the BTO rings, were projected on paper to locations on the Earth that don't actually correspond to where MH370 actually was over the planet at the time of each handshake. So MH370 wasn't anywhere on any of these rings. And this is why the underwater search along the 7th arc could not find any trace of the plane. It never went there. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 was only ever there in the southern Indian Ocean
On paper.
So extrapolating that further, in fact, we could spend the next millennium searching all the way around the 7th arc from the southern Indian Ocean all the way to Kazakhstan, 100 nautical miles either side of the arc, and we will never find the plane. But when you use the correct equation, the
equation that I derived from first principles that actually uses round-trip time of a message handshake to calculate the range of MH370 from the satellite. The aircraft location rings are correctly projected on paper to where the aircraft actually was at the time of each log-on interrogation handshake.
In part 2 of my presentation, I'll go through in closer detail about how I reanalyzed the raw satellite data and derived my MH370 range equation. So let me show you once again where MH370 actually was at the time of each of the Inmarsat handshakes or pings.
Let's follow the rings. Ping 1, 1825 UTC, just 3 minutes after MH370 was lost from primary radar at 1822, heading in a northwesterly direction towards the Andaman Seas in the Malacca Strait. An hour and 20 minutes later, the first log-on interrogation message from the Perth ground station, MH370 was somewhere along this point. Then the next set of hourly pings, the next log-on interrogation messages had the aircraft tracking in an easterly direction, pings 3, pings 4, pings 5. The final log-on interrogation message occurred at the time the aircraft was over here, on a radial somewhere that cuts through the bottom of Sri Lanka and India, and only 8 minutes after that is the 7th arc, ping 7, the 019 UTC message exchange, the last message on the Inmarsat satellite log. What's the key here? Very important, because at this point, at about 56 minutes later, less than 800 kilometres away, MH370 was seen approaching the island of Kuta Huvadu in the Maldives at 0115 UTC. This is where you'll find the missing Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. It is in Maldivian waters. This is the importance of the satellite data. It actually filled in the picture between when the aircraft was lost off radar heading northwest up the Malacca Strait towards the Andaman Islands, and then it didn't appear again till about 0115 when it popped up over the northwest of the Maldives approaching the island of Kuta Huvadu. If we superimpose an example flight path that fits these aircraft location rings, you can see which way MH370 actually ended up on the morning it vanished. It actually flew in a westerly direction, then came back easterly, and then flew back in a westerly direction. Note here the time of the last several handshakes actually have the aircraft on a radial that cuts through the bottom of Sri Lanka and tip of India. At the time of the 011 UTC handshake and the 019 second log-on attempt, MH370 was actually well en route towards the Maldives. It was just 800 kilometres and less than an hour away from the sightings that occurred over the islands of Kuta Huvadu in the Maldives. That's why the aircraft was seen above the islands in the Maldives. It was actually there. It's corroborated by the raw Inmarsat satellite data, but you have to analyse the data using the correct technique. In this example flight path, MH370's gone, they're heading somewhere, they're going to it. The pilots are flying somewhere initially, and then there's a change of plan. At ping 2, there's a change in direction. The aircraft suddenly changes and goes back in an easterly direction, either tracks east, southeast or northeast. I've shown these as a path heading back towards the Andaman Islands, and I've done that for a reason, because I think the pilots were probably looking for an island, somewhere to land this plane, trying to work out where best to put this plane down without incurring any other casualties on the ground. Ping 6 occurred when the aircraft was on a radial that cuts the bottom of Sri Lanka and India through here. So ping 6 and 7 are very close towards the satellite, and more importantly, very close to the Maldives. Remember we spoke earlier how The satellite data and the Maldives sightings always corroborated in time, but they didn't in location with the way it was analysed originally back in 2014. Well, this says that they corroborate entirely in both time and in space, in location. The time of the last message on the satellite log at 019 UTC, the aircraft was 56 minutes away and about 800 kilometres away from when the Maldives sightings saw this aircraft approach from the northwest over the island of Kuta Huvadu. So make no mistake, the aircraft that was in the Maldives on the morning of 8th of March 2014 was Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. It's corroborated by the raw satellite data if you analyse it from first principles methods. This is where you'll find a wreckage of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. It's in the Maldives.
The plane was traveling from this direction to that direction. I was remembering the colors of it. It was dark blue color and very less red color.
So many people saw that flight.
Kudohuduge gaganaka ekavis mihika e flight fenunu kama bune to matin boat fenunu mihun tagwe terega boat MH fenunu ekaki ade abdaru hama Malaysia Airlines ke flight ge photo e dekkumun abdarshid buni hama yaginomes ei hama.
So the Maldives eyewitness sightings, this was the most important clue as to where MH370 had ended up on the morning it vanished. Multiple eyewitness accounts of this aircraft approaching the island of Kuta Huvadu from the northwest. Those sightings put this aircraft at an exact location on the planet, at an exact moment in time and at a crucial time towards the end of its flight of where this plane ended up after being missing for almost 7 or so hours.
So don't forget to watch the IE3 trailer, the Independent Evidence 3 trailer at the end of this video. We do a recap on the Maldives eyewitness sightings of MH370 over the Maldives on the morning it vanished. By the way, I also include some video snippets of some new witnesses I found during my visit to Gadifushi Island in December 2015.
There were eyewitnesses on 2 islands on 2 neighbouring atolls that all saw and reported MH370 flying over their islands on the morning of 8th of March 2014. It truly was there.
So let's look at some example flight paths that will fit the ping rings. Remember, there are many flight paths within aircraft performance limitations that would fit the progressive sequence of the rings. So here's one, for example, where we've got the radar tracked the aircraft heading northwest to the Malacca Strait. Then we have the turn to the south. This is probably slightly exaggerated, but the aircraft was flown in a sort of a south-southwesterly direction, probably ended up west, and in this case I've shown it that it's possible it could have gone back flown along the equator, back as if they were coming back towards Sumatra, and then there was a change of plan and there was a beeline directly for the Maldives where it was seen approaching from the northwest. So in this example it's Sumatra along the equator and then eventually to the Maldives. The actual flight path that MH370 took across the Indian Ocean on the morning of 8th of March 2014 doesn't really matter to get it exactly correct, because you can't. When you get the black boxes, we'll be able to work that out. But what's important is that all the flight paths that fit these location rings have 3 main things in common. Number 1, they all have to start in the northwest of the Malacca Strait at the 1822 UTC last radar contact point, because the first ping happened 3 minutes after that, 1825 UTC. So the flight path would go from ping 1 to ping 2, and then they would turn
it would turn and head back in an easterly direction, east, northeast or southeast. Remember, you can think of these cross points as movable dots along the rings. So within limits, the aircraft could have flown in any sort of direction within limits of an arc. So the next point, they all have to follow the same sequence. So they'll all go ping 1, ping 2, ping 3, ping 4, ping 5, over to ping 6 at 011 UTC. That's the last log and interrogation handshake from the Perth ground station to the aircraft, and then 8 minutes after that, ping 7. So in this example, I've shown the flight path coming down along the equator and then turning and approaching from the northwest of Kuta Huvadu, because that's where the witnesses saw it coming in that direction. The third point of whatever flight path we come up with is that all flight paths end up coming through over the top of Kuta Huvadu, approaching from the northwest.
Next example, again, the idea here is to show the sequence of the rings and where the aircraft tracks. So that, again, there's a turn to the south down here. Probably should have drawn that a little bit less exaggerated, so it could have gone here, and then it tracked in a northeasterly direction back through pings 3, 4 and 5, and then it's possible it could have cut through the tip of India around the Maldives and come approaching Kuta Huvadu from the northwest as the witnesses saw it. This is one of my less favoured example flight path, because you would think that had it gone close to the mainland like this, someone would have picked it up on a radar, whether it been coming through Mali. So I tend to favour either the middle of the ocean type path along the equator, or this particular example here, which lends itself to the location of the rings being such that the pilots were actually looking at islands. See, I think they were actually looking at islands, somewhere to ditch this aircraft that had been crippled, and they had to ditch the plane. So I've shown this one, turn to the south, heads towards ping 2 in a westerly direction, then it turns and heads in an easterly, northeasterly direction, and you'll notice the Andaman Islands are up here. So it's possible they had a look at the Andaman Islands to see if there was somewhere possible to land it. Mind you, in this period, don't forget, perhaps part of the reason for the turn back towards the east is that at this point they were still in darkness. There was no sunrise here just yet, so tracking in an easterly direction, obviously they're travelling towards sunlight, daylight, and obviously visibility to help assess the situation and work out where to land this Boeing 777. So at that point we know, when you look at the handshake 6, that obviously there was something, potentially if they had gone to the Andaman Islands and thought it's too risky, too dangerous to try and land there, they've decided and made a decision to go to the Maldives. So this is, I guess, one of my favoured scenarios of example flight path that I've drawn. We've gone from the Andaman Islands towards the tip of Sri Lanka, equator, and then eventually to the Maldives. See, the fact that if it approached from the northwest and had come in along, at some point coming along the equator, it would certainly not be detected by the radars in Mali.
Or the one at Garn Island.
if you look at the sequence of the rings, this tells us a wealth of information about what was going on with MH370 on that morning. This says that humans were still flying the plane, and look, most likely the pilots were still trying to find a place to land this plane. I believe the pilots were actually trying to save the plane. I certainly don't believe in any of the hijacking, rogue pilot, suicide mission theories that are bantering around with MH370.
The most logical reason is that they were heading for an emergency airport. There are several theories about what caused flight MH370 to suddenly turn back over the Gulf of Thailand. Here I take a look at one of the theories.
So one of the things that might have caused MH370 to suddenly turn back over the Gulf of Thailand is some sort of external engine fire. Here's an image I found of an example showing a right-hand engine fire where you can see the flames are shooting out under the right-hand side wing. My train of thought around, for example, if something like this was the cause of the sudden turnback of MH370, we can understand there's quite a lot of frantic activity going on in the cockpit to get this plane back to the mainland. You can see the flame here is fairly close to the right-hand side landing gear. Notice also you've got one of the VHF antennas under the aircraft. What we don't know is in the middle of the flight, you don't know how long the flame actually shoots back and whether there's any wind conditions that actually made the flame feed back onto parts of the plane sporadically. It could have damaged the antenna, so we get no transponder transmissions or voice transmissions out of that particular VHF antenna. With the flame so close under the wing or the landing gear, potentially there's damage or melted components or something to do with the landing gear being inoperative on the right hand side. The tyre could have caught on fire, for example. There could be some ongoing effects that would damage the aircraft or some systems on the aircraft. Let's hypothetically say something like this happened to MH370. They've shut down the engine, but there's some damage left behind, or there's still a right-hand side tyre smouldering or burning. So here what they have is the sudden turnback heading for the mainland has all indications that they were heading for an emergency airport and they wanted to land the plane, but they couldn't. This would prevent them from landing properly on solid ground.
So now the pilots of MH370 are stuck with a plane they can fly, but they can't land it.
I think they were stuck with an aircraft that they could still keep flying, keep airborne. They weren't falling out of the sky, but that they weren't able to land nor communicate to the outside world because of, like for example in my scenario of a right-hand engine fire, some damage had been caused to some of the comms antennas and also the landing gear. So whether it was that the right-hand side gear couldn't retract or was partially retracted or was smouldering on fire, that remains to be seen once the wreckage is found.
The possibility that it was an external fire incident that caused MH370 to suddenly turn back is actually supported by a number of clues that came to light as the mystery of MH370 unfolded. Well, you remember there were some sightings of a burning plane at around the time MH370 disappeared. The first one, the oil rig worker Mackay, who was in the South China Sea on an oil rig and witnessed a burning plane high in the sky. Well, his triangulation point makes it possible that he actually saw the moment the aircraft turned back. So you remember he said he only saw the flames for 10 to 15 seconds before they extinguished. So he probably witnessed the moment the right-hand side engine was shut down, or that the plane shot up to 45,000 feet, or likely even higher, to remove the oxygen and extinguish the fire. If you recall, after spotting the plane on fire, the oil rig worker only saw the flames for 10 to 15 seconds before they extinguished. So the pilots of MH370 managed to actually put the fire out and preserve the integrity of the airframe, which of course allowed it to continue flying for over 7 hours more. But it obviously left damage. By the way, you can do some analysis that actually allows you to determine it was quite possible that Mike McKay did actually see MH370 at high altitude over his horizon. So now the pilots of MH370 are stuck with a plane they can fly, but they can't land it. They can't land it on solid ground. Or maybe they were concerned that the undercarriage of the aircraft had been structurally damaged or compromised by the fire. They can't land it on solid ground. From the oil rig worker in the South China Sea to sightings across the Malaysian Peninsula and fishermen up near Thailand and Malaysia, and of course the Miss Catherine T or Miss Kate T's sighting of a burning plane as she was sailing to Phuket.
I think one of the most important eyewitness accounts relating to MH370 was that of Miss Kate T, who was on a sailing boat heading to Phuket when she reported seeing a plane on fire with thick black smoke coming out from behind it, trailing behind it. This was an image from the Saucy Solaris website that portrayed an artist's impression of what she described that she saw. Now, I've heard a number of different explanations for what the orange glow could be, except for the most obvious one, and that is what Miss Kate T was looking at was the orange glow was the effect of flames burning on the other side of the plane, the side she couldn't see, and what she was seeing was the effect of an orange glow under the shiny reflective fuselage of a typical aircraft like this. Because of course we remember that the timing of her sighting was consistent with MH370 having disappeared at that time and was somewhere flying around.
Notice once you have the MH370 location rings correctly projected, these rings also corroborate with the sighting of Miss Catherine T of a burning plane going north to south across her boat as she was sailing across the Indian Ocean. The pilots of MH370 are stuck with a plane they can fly, but they can't land it. They can't land it on solid ground.
They kept the aircraft airborne for the maximum possible time, as long as they could, because it was probably the safest place to be. Because the one thing they knew is they could still fly this plane. They weren't falling out of the sky. What they didn't know, the problem was going to be trying to land it. See, I think they couldn't land it on solid ground, otherwise it would have been down. They knew they only had one shot at putting this plane on the ground. And I think they were desperately looking for some remote location and uninhabited by population with shallow water to attempt an emergency landing with a crippled aircraft. Some people call it a ditching, and I think they were looking at islands.
But you can start to understand this once you have the aircraft location rings, the Inmarsat ping rings, correctly projected. You see, you have to have the aircraft location rings correctly projected onto the Earth, and then you can start to understand what was going on with MH370 on the morning it vanished, and you can actually solve the mystery. you can see that the aircraft took a west-east-west, like a skewed zigzag path across the Indian Ocean, whilst the SATCOM system on board MH370 was exchanging messages over the Inmarsat network after the system logged back on at 1825 UTC. The reason MH370 cannot be found in the southern Indian Ocean is because the aircraft actually ended up in the Maldives, exactly as witnesses had seen the plane on the morning that it vanished. And now furthermore, it's actually corroborated by the raw Inmarsat satellite data as well, as you start to draw some example flight paths that fit these new ping rings. Everything connects.
Recall we saw this picture earlier that told us that we don't yet have the right answer. There are disconnects. What it really says is that MH370 is not in the southern Indian Ocean. The SIO conclusion is the odd one out. If you analyse the raw Inmarsat satellite data correctly, what you get is a cohesive picture. Everything connects. Suddenly, all the pieces of the MH370 puzzle come together and they corroborate that Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 actually ended up in the Maldives. So let me show you how you connect these pieces of the puzzle in sequence, and they'll show us a path to where MH370 ended up and ultimately to the location of the wreckage. Okay, so this picture looks a little bit busy, but what's important is follow the timeline from right to left. I'll put this up on my website and you can have a look at it in slow time. You have to read it from right to left.
So we have the sudden turnback of MH370 over the Gulf of Thailand. MH370 was in trouble. They had to get this plane back quickly. The sudden turnback from a mid-air incident that left the pilots with a plane that could fly, but they couldn't land. So major systems damaged that prevented the aircraft from being landed on solid ground. That's why they couldn't put it down, on solid ground at least. All they could do was keep flying the plane, because they weren't falling out of the sky. And it was lost at 1822, heading northwest up the Malacca Straits. Then this is where we have the importance of the Inmarsat satellite data. The Inmarsat satellite data analysis that projects the ping ring showing the aircraft flew in a west-easterly west direction as it flew across the Indian Ocean during the period when the aircraft SATCOM system was exchanging messages over the Inmarsat satellite network. The skewed zigzag flight path taken over the course of the 6 hours in this period, a telltale sign that humans were still in control in the cockpit, desperately looking for somewhere to attempt an emergency landing of this aircraft in shallow waters of some uninhabited region. I think they were looking for some remote island. Less than an hour after the last Inmarsat handshake was recorded, the aircraft is seen approaching the island of Kuta Huvadu from the northwest, flying low and slow and then deliberately banking towards the southern tip of the Maldives. A second group of islanders saw the same plane over Gadifushi Island, circling, looking for somewhere to land, a spot to put this plane down, having been airborne some 8 hours and 34 minutes since takeoff. Absolutely astonishing. It was time to come down. Time to have a go at landing this crippled Boeing 777. As the aircraft came in for an emergency landing attempt in the shallow waters, unfortunately it most likely sank fairly rapidly, and then bang, we got the acoustic event. The Curtin University acoustic event picked up a signal in the vicinity of the Maldives. The crash site along the eastern slope of the Chagos-Laccadive Ridge, which the Maldives chains are a part of. The sound wave travels from the point of impact and it is detected by the Curtin University hydrophones along the coast of Western Australia. The deduced impact time is 01:33 UTC. That's 6:33 AM Maldives local time, where the large mass of the Boeing 777 impacted. the coral reef seabed of the Maldives atolls. So it would have been during this period that the undercarriage of the aircraft and the trailing edge of the flap and the flaperons scraped and dragged along the coral reef seabed of the atoll. The superstructure eventually coming to rest, by and large, near fully intact. I suspect broke into a couple of large sections here. In particular, the nose section appears to be broken away. And this is an image of what I believe is the missing Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 submerged in the waters of the Maldives. In proximity to the Maldives eyewitness sightings.
You see from the air the reef flat of an atoll.
It looks like a pad where you can try and land an aircraft on, and without causing any injury to anyone on the ground if you find a clear spot.
The round edge rim of an atoll looks like a runway. So you can easily understand how, from a pilot's perspective, there's essentially a makeshift runway here to attempt a landing. You've got some shallow water, you've got some hard rock underneath, so it was probably the
only thing
the MH370 pilots had by way of a landing strip under the circumstances. Now, I've been to the region and I can tell you there is absolutely nothing around for kilometres, but the problem is, on the atoll, it's like landing on the top of an underwater volcano, and there's absolutely no way of knowing exactly how the aircraft is going to stop. So here's my scenario. The pilots came in to land along the atoll, and they're coming in to land on the atoll, flaps down, flaperon down, and they come in and they touch down in the water. You remember the trailing edge of the flaperon and the Tanzanian flap is all scraped away. Well, to me, you would get that as a result of landing on the hard coral reef surface of the Maldives atoll as the plane landed and scraped after sinking from the water.
From that day, the swirling currents of the Indian Ocean produced firstly some strange appearing aircraft debris that landed on some Maldives islands, as you would expect, being in proximity to the crash site. And then in later months, debris would start appearing in 2016 on the eastern coast of Africa at the Mozambique Channel, where a lot of the debris of MH370 or suspected aircraft debris has been collected. Also, the Reunion Island flaperon. All these pieces of the MH370 puzzle connect together in time water sequence and in space, and it gives us a path of flight MH370 on the morning that it vanished and where it ultimately ended up. The vanishing of Flight 370 was a tragedy, a desperate and heroic race against time, trying to save 239 who on that day were united as one.